In a quiet little town surrounded by rolling hills and tall oak trees, there lived a boy named Liam. He was 10 years old, with curly brown hair that always seemed to stick out in odd directions no matter how much his mom tried to comb it down. His bright blue eyes sparkled with mischief, and he had a knack for making people laugh even when they didn't want to. But beneath his playful exterior, Liam had a big heart. He cared deeply about his family, especially his grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor wasn't just any grandmother. She was the kind who baked cookies shaped like stars, told stories about her childhood adventures, and gave hugs so warm they could melt away even the worst day. To Liam, she was a superhero without a cape. She'd been married once to a man named Harold, but he passed away long before Liam was born. Since then, Eleanor had devoted herself to raising her kids and doting on her grandchildren. Her home was always filled with laughter, love, and the smell of freshly baked pies. This year something special was happening, Eleanor's 75th birthday. It wasn't just another milestone. It was an event the whole family had been looking forward to for months. Everyone agreed it needed to be unforgettable. So plans were made, decorations, food, games, and of course, the centerpiece, a massive birthday cake topped with edible flowers and candles that would light up the room. Liam's mom, Sarah, took charge of organizing everything. She wanted every detail to be perfect because Eleanor deserved nothing less. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, Sarah stumbled upon an old photo album. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages smelled faintly of lavender. Curious, she flipped through it and found pictures of Eleanor from decades ago, young, radiant, and full of life. There was one photo in particular that caught Sarah's eye. A black and white image of Eleanor dressed in an elegant gown, standing beside a handsome man at some sort of fancy ball. The date stamped on the corner read, 1962. Sarah brought the album downstairs and showed it to Liam. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the picture. "This is your grandma when she was younger. Isn't she beautiful?" Liam squinted at the photo, tilting his head slightly. "Wow," he murmured. "She looks like a princess." Then, after a pause, he added, "I think I should dress up like a prince for her party." Sarah laughed, but quickly realized Liam was serious. "You know what? That's actually a great idea," she exclaimed. "Why don't you wear your best suit and pretend you're Grandma's Prince Charming? You can give her a speech too, telling her how much she means to you." Excited by the plan, Liam spent days practicing his speech. He wrote it out carefully on note cards, crossing out words and rewriting sentences until he thought it sounded just right. Every evening, he stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing his lines with dramatic hand gestures and exaggerated expressions. Sometimes his little sister Emily would giggle uncontrollably from the doorway, but Liam didn't mind. He knew he had an important job to do. The morning of the big day arrived, crisp and sunny. The house buzzed with activity as relatives poured in from all over town. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends bustled around, setting up tables, hanging streamers, and arranging bouquets of fresh flowers. Liam woke up early, determined to look his best. He put on his navy blue suit, adjusted his bow tie until it sat perfectly straight, and polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors. When he finally stepped into the living room, everyone cheered. "You look so handsome," Sarah gushed, snapping a quick picture with her phone. Even Eleanor clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, Liam, you really do look like a prince," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. As the hours ticked by, the celebration grew livelier. Plates piled high with finger foods circulated among the guests, and children ran around playing tag. Laughter echoed through the house, mingling with the sweet scent of Eleanor's famous apple pie. By the time dessert rolled around, anticipation hung thick in the air. The enormous cake sat proudly on the dining table, its intricate design drawing admiring glances from everyone. Liam stood near the doorway, nervously fidgeting with his note cards. He felt butterflies fluttering in his stomach, but reminded himself why he was doing this for Grandma. He wanted to make her feel loved and appreciated, like the queen she truly was. As the last plates were cleared away, Sarah nodded encouragingly at him. Taking a deep breath, Liam stepped forward, ready to deliver his speech. Little did he know, his words would set off a chain reaction that none of them could have predicted. As the final plates were cleared from the dining table, the room buzzed with excitement. The towering birthday cake stood proudly in the center, its candles flickering like tiny stars against the dimmed lights. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her eyes twinkling with joy as she watched her family laugh and chatter around her. She looked radiant, dressed in a soft lavender dress that matched the flowers adorning the cake. Everyone knew what came next, the moment when Liam would step forward to honor his grandmother with a heartfelt speech. Liam took a deep breath, clutching his note cards tightly in one hand while holding a spoon in the other. He tapped it gently against his glass, producing a clear, ringing sound that silenced the room almost instantly. All eyes turned to him, and for a brief second, he felt the weight of their attention pressing down on his shoulders. But then he glanced at Eleanor, who gave him an encouraging smile, and his nerves began to settle. Standing tall, he straightened his bow tie and cleared his throat. "Hi, everyone," Liam began, his voice steady but slightly higher pitched than usual. "So, today is Grandma's 75th birthday, which is pretty cool because she's amazing." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, easing some of the tension. Emboldened, Liam continued. "She's always been there for me, for all of us. She makes the best cookies, tells the best stories, and gives the best hugs. I don't think I've ever seen her mad, even when I accidentally broke her favorite vase last year." This earned another round of chuckles, and Liam relaxed further, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "But you know what?" he said, pausing dramatically. "Grandma isn't just nice. She's also really smart. Like super smart. She knows everything about plants and animals and history and stuff. And she looks so classy too." At this point, Liam pulled out the old photo album Sarah had shown him earlier. Holding it up for everyone to see, he pointed to the picture of Eleanor in her elegant gown. "Look at this. Doesn't she look like a princess? That's why I decided to dress up fancy tonight, to be her Prince Charming." Eleanor blushed deeply, waving her hands modestly as if to dismiss the compliment, but her smile was unmistakable. The guests murmured approvingly, clearly charmed by Liam's sweet words. For a moment it seemed like the speech was going perfectly. But then something shifted. As Liam flipped to the next page of the photo album, his expression grew more thoughtful. His tone changed, becoming less playful and more serious, but, he hesitated, glancing nervously at Eleanor before continuing. "There's something else I want to say. Grandma, you're awesome, but sometimes, well, you seem kind of mysterious." The room fell eerily quiet. Even the faint hum of conversation outside the window seemed to fade away. Eleanor stiffened, slightly, though she tried to keep smiling. Her son, Thomas, exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. "What do you mean, mysterious?" someone joked weakly, trying to lighten the mood. But Liam didn't pick up on the cue. Instead, he pressed on, oblivious to the growing unease in the room. "I mean," he explained earnestly, "you never talk about Grandpa, or why there are so many boxes locked away in your attic. What's in those boxes, Grandma? Why won't you tell us?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared wide-eyed at Liam, unsure how to react. Eleanor's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the table as if bracing herself. No one had expected such a question. Not here, not now. Birthdays were supposed to be happy occasions filled with laughter and love, not moments of uncomfortable probing. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, ready to intervene, but Liam wasn't finished. "I'm not saying it's bad or anything," he added quickly, sensing that he might have said something wrong. "I'm just curious. You're always telling us to ask questions and learn new things, so I thought maybe it was okay to ask." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Relatives who had been chatting happily moments ago now avoided each other's gazes. Thomas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, while his wife whispered urgently into his ear. Even the children who had been giggling and playing nearby sensed the tension and quieted down. Eleanor finally broke the silence, forcing a shaky smile onto her face. "Oh, Liam," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You certainly know how to make things interesting, don't you?" Her attempt at humor fell flat, met only by awkward murmurs from the guests. She reached for her water glass, taking a long sip to steady herself. No one dared to interrupt or change the subject. The once cheerful celebration now felt like a fragile bubble on the verge of bursting. And just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, fate intervened in the most unexpected and disastrous way possible. Just as the heavy silence began to suffocate the room, a loud creak echoed through the dining area. At first, no one paid much attention. After all, old houses like Eleanor's often made strange noises. But then came another sound, sharper and more alarming. The unmistakable wobble of the table beneath the massive birthday cake. Liam, still standing near the head of the table, froze mid-sentence. His wide eyes darted toward the dessert, which was now swaying precariously. Someone at the far end of the table had leaned too heavily on its edge while reaching for a napkin, causing one leg to tilt dangerously. For a split second, time seemed to slow down. The candles flickered wildly as if protesting their impending doom, and the glittering decorations on the cake shimmered under the chandelier's glow. And then, it happened. With a deafening crash, the cake toppled over, sending frosting, shards of porcelain, and tiny edible flowers flying in every direction. The impact reverberated through the room, followed by an eerie silence so profound that even the distant chirping of crickets outside felt deafening. Everyone stared in shock at the mess on the floor, a soggy heap of vanilla layers, chocolate, drizzle, and scattered candles lying amidst broken plates. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Eleanor burst into tears, not because of the ruined cake, but because of Liam's earlier questions. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs escaped her lips. Her son Thomas shot up from his seat, rushing to her side. He glared accusingly at Sarah, who stood frozen near the doorway, guilt etched across her face. "Why, did you let him say those things?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "You knew how sensitive this topic is." Sarah threw up her hands defensively. "I didn't tell him to ask about the attic or Grandpa. He came up with that himself," she retorted, her own voice trembling. "Besides, maybe it's time we talked about these things instead of pretending they don't exist." Their argument sparked a chain reaction. Relatives who had been silently stewing over Liam's words joined in, airing grievances they'd kept bottled up for years. One cousin accused another of hogging Eleanor's attention during family gatherings. An aunt muttered loudly about how rarely certain members bothered to visit. Even distant relatives who barely knew each other started bickering over trivial matters, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger and hurt feelings. Meanwhile, Liam stood rooted to the spot, utterly bewildered by the explosion around him. All he'd wanted was to make his grandma happy, to show her how much he loved and admired her. Instead, he'd somehow managed to tear apart the harmony of the entire family. Tears welled up in his eyes as he watched the people he cared about, most shouting and pointing fingers at one another. Overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, he turned and bolted out of the room before anyone could stop him. The front door slammed shut behind him, leaving the house eerily silent once again, except for the muffled sounds of crying and arguing drifting from the dining room. Outside, the cool night air hit Liam like a wave, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside him. He ran, blindly down the driveway, his polished shoes slapping against the pavement until he reached the edge of the property. There, he collapsed onto the grass beneath a towering oak tree, hugging his knees to his chest. Back inside, the scene was equally chaotic. Eleanor had stopped crying, but remained pale and shaken, clutching a tissue in trembling hands. Thomas and Sarah continued their heated exchange, oblivious to the fact that Eleanor was growing visibly distressed. Finally, one of the older cousins stepped in, raising her voice above the din. "Enough!" she shouted. "Look at yourselves. Is this really what Grandma deserves on her birthday? Fighting like children?" Her words cut through the tension like a knife. Slowly, the arguments subsided, though the damage had already been done. The once jovial gathering now felt fractured, the weight of unresolved emotions pressing down on everyone. Some guests began gathering their belongings, murmuring apologies as they slipped out the door. Others lingered awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or leave. Eleanor, however, remained seated at the head of the table, staring blankly at the empty space where the cake had once stood. Her mind raced with memories she'd tried so hard to bury, the secrets she'd kept locked away in dusty boxes upstairs. She thought about Harold, the man she'd loved and lost, and the choices she'd made in the wake of his departure. Most of all, she thought about Liam. Her sweet, well-meaning grandson had unknowingly opened a Pandora's box of truths, and now there was no turning back. As the evening wore on, the remaining family members began cleaning up the wreckage. Plates were stacked, chairs pushed in, and the sticky remnants of the cake swept into the trash. Though the physical mess was cleared away, the emotional scars lingered. No one spoke much, and when they did, their words were hesitant, tinged with regret and unease. It was clear that the celebration had taken a turn none of them could have anticipated, and that the road to healing would be long and difficult. But even in the midst of the turmoil, a small seed of hope remained. Eleanor glanced toward the window, wondering where Liam had gone. Despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude for her grandson's honesty. Perhaps she thought his innocent curiosity had uncovered something necessary, something that needed to come to light if her family was ever going to truly understand her. And maybe, just maybe, this painful night would lead to a deeper connection between them all. Hours after the disastrous birthday celebration, the house finally fell silent. The last of the guests had left, some with hurried apologies and others with quiet nods, their faces etched with a mix of guilt and exhaustion. Eleanor sat alone, in her rocking chair by the living room window, staring out at the darkened yard. The faint glow of the porch light illuminated the oak tree where Liam had disappeared earlier, but there was no sign of him now. Her heart ached, not just for the ruined cake or the arguments that had erupted, but for the weight of secrets she'd carried for so long. Sarah, her daughter-in-law, approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Eleanor," she began gently, "I'm so sorry about everything tonight. I never meant for any of this to happen." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of her regret. Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes meeting Sarah's. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor sighed deeply and gestured for Sarah to sit beside her. "It's not your fault," she said softly, her tone tinged with both sadness and resignation. "Liam didn't mean any harm either. He's just curious. And maybe—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe he's right. Maybe it is time I told you all the truth." Sarah blinked in surprise. "The truth?" she echoed, unsure what Eleanor meant. Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting back to the window. "About Harold," she clarified. "About why I never talk about him, or those boxes in the attic." Her voice was steady, though it carried the weight of years buried beneath layers of silence. For a moment, Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. This was uncharted territory. Eleanor had always been the rock of the family, the one who kept everyone together. To hear her admit there were things she'd hidden, things that might explain her guardedness, was both startling and heartbreaking. But Sarah could see the vulnerability in Eleanor's expression, the way her hands trembled as she clasped them tightly in her lap. Whatever this truth was, it had clearly shaped Eleanor's life in ways no one else understood. "Do you want to tell me now?" Sarah asked gently, leaning forward. Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "But tomorrow morning I'll gather everyone who's still here. It's time they know the whole story, not just pieces of it. With that, she stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. For now, let's find Liam. He needs to hear this too. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was subdued. Those who had stayed overnight gathered in the living room, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Eleanor sat in her usual spot, her posture straight despite the heaviness in her heart. Beside her, Liam perched nervously on the edge of the couch, his bow tie askew and his cheeks flushed with guilt. He hadn't spoken much since returning home late the previous night, having been found asleep under the oak tree by Thomas. Now, he clutched a blanket around his shoulders, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When everyone was settled, Eleanor cleared her throat. "Thank you all for staying," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I know last night was difficult, but I also think it may have been necessary." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of her children, grandchildren, and extended family. "There are things I've kept hidden for a very long time. Things I thought I was protecting you from. But now I realize that keeping secrets only builds walls between us, and I don't want that anymore." A hush fell over the room as Eleanor took a deep breath. "When I married Harold, I believed we'd spend our lives together. We were young and in love, and I thought we had everything figured out. But soon after the wedding, I realized something was wrong. Harold wasn't happy, not with me, not with our life. He struggled with feelings he couldn't express, fears he couldn't face. One day he simply left. No note, no explanation, just gone." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by stunned silence. Some relatives exchanged glances while others stared at Eleanor in disbelief. "I told everyone he died in an accident because I couldn't bear the shame of admitting the truth," Eleanor continued, her voice wavering slightly. "Back then, people judged women whose husbands left them. I didn't want pity, or worse, judgment for raising my kids alone. So I lied. And over time, the lie became easier to live with than the truth." Liam listened intently, his wide eyes locked onto his grandmother's face. He hadn't expected this revelation, and it filled him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Eleanor smiled faintly, reaching out to pat his hand. "Because I was afraid, sweetheart. Afraid of being seen differently, afraid of reopening old wounds. But your questions last night made me realize that hiding the truth doesn't protect anyone. It only keeps us apart. And I don't want that for our family." As Eleanor spoke, tears welled up in the eyes of several relatives. Thomas, her son, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Mom, why didn't you ever say anything to me? I would have understood." "I know you would have," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted to shield you from the pain I felt. I thought if I acted strong, you wouldn't miss what you never had. But now I see that strength doesn't come from hiding. It comes from facing the truth together." The room grew quiet again, the weight of Eleanor's confession settling over everyone. Slowly, the mood shifted from shock to empathy. One by one, family members began sharing their own thoughts and feelings. A cousin admitted she'd always wondered why Eleanor seemed distant during certain conversations. An aunt confessed that she'd felt guilty for not visiting more often, assuming Eleanor preferred solitude. Even Thomas opened up about his lingering resentment toward his absent father, a feeling he'd buried for decades. Through it all, Eleanor listened patiently, nodding occasionally and offering words of reassurance. By the end of the discussion, The tension that had gripped the family for years began to loosen. They realized that many of their misunderstandings stemmed from assumptions born out of silence. Finally, Eleanor turned to Liam, pulling him into a tight hug. "You didn't ruin anything, my dear boy," she murmured, stroking his hair. "In fact, you gave us a gift. You reminded us that honesty, even when it's hard, brings us closer." Liam hugged her back fiercely, his guilt melting away. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he whispered. "I didn't mean to upset you." "I know," Eleanor replied, kissing the top of his head. "And I love you for asking the questions no one else dared to. Sometimes breaking things apart is the first step to putting them back together." With those words, the family began to heal, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. They spent the rest of the day talking, laughing, and reminiscing about happier times. Though scars remained, they knew they were stronger for having faced the truth together. And as the sun set over the hills, casting golden light through the windows, Eleanor sat once again in her rocking chair, smiling softly at the family she loved more than anything. The days following Eleanor's heartfelt confession brought a quiet but profound transformation to the family. What had started as a chaotic and emotionally charged evening turned into an opportunity for healing, one that none of them had anticipated. The weight of secrets once buried deep beneath layers of silence began to lift, allowing fresh air to seep through cracks in their relationships. For the first time in years, conversations flowed freely, not just about everyday matters, but about feelings, regrets, and hopes for the future. Eleanor, though still processing her own emotions, felt lighter than she had in decades. Sharing her story with her family hadn't been easy. It required courage she didn't know she possessed, but it was worth every difficult moment. Her children and grandchildren listened intently, asking questions and offering support in ways that reassured her they weren't judging her. Instead, they embraced her vulnerability, seeing her not just as their strong matriarch but as a human being who had endured pain and loss. Liam, in particular, became even more devoted to his grandmother. He spent hours sitting beside her on the porch, peppering her with thoughtful questions about her life before he was born. "What was your favorite memory with Grandpa?" he asked one afternoon, his voice tinged with curiosity rather than accusation this time. Eleanor smiled softly, leaning back in her chair as she recalled a summer picnic by the lake, a rare, happy moment from her marriage. "I remember how he used to whistle when he was nervous," she said, chuckling at the memory. "It drove me crazy sometimes, but now I miss it." Liam nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. Though he still felt guilty about the events of the birthday party, Eleanor reassured him repeatedly that his innocent curiosity had sparked something necessary, a chance for everyone to reconnect on a deeper level. Slowly, the rest of the family followed suit. Conversations that had once been surface level or strained grew richer and more meaningful. Cousins who rarely spoke began exchanging stories about their lives, discovering shared interests they never knew existed. Aunts and uncles who had harbored grudges over petty disagreements found themselves laughing together over old photographs and childhood antics. Even Thomas, Eleanor's son, softened toward his siblings, admitting during one dinner that he'd resented their closeness growing up because he'd always felt like an outsider. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the family gathered around the dining table once again. This time, however, there were no fancy decorations or towering cakes, just simple dishes prepared with love. Sarah suggested the idea as a way to rebuild what had been broken. "Let's have a do-over," she said with a hopeful smile. "No speeches, no pressure. Just us being together." Everyone agreed enthusiastically, eager to reclaim the joy that had eluded them during the original celebration. Liam, dressed in his everyday clothes instead of the dapper suit, helped set the table, humming a cheerful tune under his breath. His little sister, Emily, giggled as she placed mismatched napkins at each seat, declaring it quirky and fun. Eleanor watched them with tears glistening in her eyes, grateful for the renewed sense of unity. As they ate, laughter filled the room, mingling with the clinking of forks against plates. Someone brought up a hilarious story about Eleanor accidentally setting off the fire alarm while attempting to bake cookies one Christmas. Another relative recounted the time Liam tried to build a treehouse and ended up getting stuck halfway up the ladder. Each tale drew roars of laughter, breaking down any lingering walls between them. Midway through the meal, Eleanor stood up, holding her glass of lemonade aloft. "To second chances," she announced, her voice steady and warm. "And to the Yuangsu, people I love most in this world. Thank you for sticking by me, even when I made it hard for you to understand why I did the things I did." Her words prompted a chorus of cheers and raised glasses. Liam grinned widely, raising his own glass. "Hi, and thank you, Grandma, for being brave enough to tell us the truth," he added, earning nods of agreement from everyone around the table. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere was so light and joyful that it was almost impossible to believe how tense things had been just a few days prior. As dessert was served, a modest homemade pie baked by Eleanor herself, the family lingered, unwilling to let the night end. They played board games, told jokes, and sang songs long after the dishes were cleared away. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness and unresolved tension, but it was real, and that authenticity meant everything. In the weeks that followed, the family continued to grow closer. Eleanor began inviting her children and grandchildren over more often, hosting casual Sunday dinners where everyone could unwind and share updates about their lives. She even started working on sorting through the boxes in her attic, enlisting Liam's help to go through old letters, photographs, and keepsakes. Together, they uncovered pieces of her past that painted a fuller picture of who she was, a woman who had faced hardships but emerged stronger because of them. For Liam, the experience taught him the power of honesty and empathy. He realized that asking questions didn't make him nosy or disrespectful. It showed that he cared deeply about understanding those he loved. And while he promised himself to be more mindful of timing and context in the future, he also vowed never to shy away from seeking truth, even when it was uncomfortable. As for Eleanor, she found peace in knowing that her family finally saw her, not just as the glue that held them together, but as a person with dreams, struggles, and imperfections. The scars of her past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they became part of her story, one she was proud to share with the people who mattered most. On a crisp autumn morning several months later, Liam sat on the porch, steps beside his grandmother, watching the leaves swirl in the breeze. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think we're kind of like this tree." He pointed to the sturdy oak standing tall in the yard. "It's been through storms and winds, but it's still here, stronger than ever." Eleanor smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's a beautiful way to put it, sweetheart. Life is full of storms, but if we face them together, we can weather anything." And with that, they sat in comfortable silence, basking in the warmth of a family that had come back together, not despite its flaws but because of them.